The bell above the diner door rang just once, but every conversation inside suddenly faded. Malcolm Owens noticed it immediately. Years of investigative work had trained him to recognize silence better than noise. Silence always meant fear, and fear usually pointed toward power. Outside, a humid summer morning settled over Ridgedale County, Kentucky. The town looked peaceful from a distance. White church steeples rose above old brick storefronts. American flags fluttered along Main Street. Pickup trucks lined the curbs. Nothing about the place suggested trouble. Yet Malcolm had learned long ago that appearances often protected ugly truths. He sat across from his partner, Terrence Blake, in a corner booth at Brenda's Grill House. Both men wore casual clothes, polo shirts, jeans, comfortable shoes. They looked like travelers stopping for breakfast during a weekend road trip. That illusion was intentional. 12 hours earlier, they had left Frankfurt carrying a confidential assignment from the Kentucky Bureau of Professional Standards. 8 citizen complaints had accumulated against a sheriff sergeant named Dale Hutchins. The accusation sounded familiar. Illegal stops, threats, harassment, selective enforcement. Every complaint had mysteriously disappeared inside local review processes. Captain Elaine Crawford had delivered the assignment personally. "I don't want assumptions," she told them. "I want evidence. Go there, observe, blend in, let the truth reveal itself." Now Malcolm stirred his coffee while studying the room. The diner smelled of bacon grease and fresh biscuits. A ceiling fan rotated slowly overhead. Farmers discussed weather forecasts. Retirees traded fishing stories. A young mother entertained her daughter with crayons. Ordinary life unfolded around them. Yet something felt off. Brenda Carlyle, the owner, seemed nervous. She kept glancing toward the entrance. Twice she wiped the same clean section of counter. Her smile appeared rehearsed, forced. Terrence noticed it too. "She's expecting someone," he said quietly. Malcolm nodded. "Or afraid of someone." That answer hung between them. Malcolm looked through the front window toward the courthouse across the street. A Confederate memorial stood on the lawn despite years of debate about its removal. Nearby, a patrol vehicle sat parked where everyone could see it. Symbols mattered. They revealed what communities celebrated and what they refused to confront. Terrence sipped his coffee. "You ever wonder if things actually change?" Malcolm considered the question. His father had marched during civil rights demonstrations in Alabama decades earlier. His grandfather had served in the army but returned home to segregated neighborhoods. Progress existed. He knew that, yet progress rarely moved in straight lines. "Sometimes," Malcolm answered, "but change usually starts when somebody finally gets caught believing they're untouchable." The bell above the door rang again. A man entered wearing a sheriff's department uniform. Everything shifted, conversations lowered, shoulders stiffened, eyes dropped toward plates. Sergeant Dale Hutchins walked inside with complete confidence. He wasn't especially large. He didn't need to be. Authority carried its own weight. Behind him followed a younger deputy who looked uncomfortable before anything had even happened. Hutchins scanned the room. His gaze stopped on Malcolm and Terrence, immediately. No hesitation, no curiosity, just recognition of something he had already decided didn't belong. He approached their booth slowly. The diner grew quiet enough for Malcolm to hear silverware touching ceramic plates. "Morning," Hutchins said. The word sounded friendly. His eyes did not. "Morning," Malcolm replied. Hutchins remained standing. "Passing through town? Just having breakfast? Where are you staying?" Terrence glanced up. "Is there a reason you're asking?" A faint smile crossed Hutchins's face. The smile disappeared almost instantly. "Because I asked." Malcolm felt something settle inside him. A familiar feeling, the moment when suspicion transforms into confirmation. The younger deputy shifted nervously behind his superior. Brenda stopped wiping the counter. Nobody spoke. Outside, sunlight reflected off the patrol car parked near the curb. Inside, the temperature suddenly felt 10 degrees warmer. Malcolm slowly placed his coffee cup onto the table. Then he looked directly into Dale Hutchins's eyes. And for the first time that morning, he realized the investigation might uncover far more than anyone expected. Dale Hutchins stood beside the booth without invitation. His shadow stretched across the table and covered Malcolm's breakfast plate. The gesture felt intentional. Everything about him felt intentional. Malcolm remained seated. Years of experience had taught him that people often revealed themselves when nobody challenged their authority. The less he said, the more Hutchins would likely volunteer. "Need to see your identification," the sergeant said. The request came abruptly. Terrence looked around the diner. Nobody appeared surprised. That bothered him more than the request itself. "For breakfast?" Terrence asked. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Hutchins crossed his arms. "For being in my county." The words settled heavily over the room. Malcolm noticed Brenda staring toward the floor. An elderly couple avoided eye contact completely. A teenage waitress froze near the coffee station. This wasn't new. Everyone here had seen some version of this before. Malcolm slowly removed his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Terrence did the same. Neither man argued. Hutchins examined both licenses with exaggerated attention. "Out of state," he muttered. The younger deputy accepted the licenses and stepped outside to run them through dispatch. Several long minutes passed. Nobody touched their food. Nobody resumed conversation. The entire diner seemed suspended in uncertainty. Finally, the deputy returned. "Everything's clear, Sergeant." That should have ended the encounter. Legally, professionally, morally. Instead, Hutchins leaned forward. "We've had problems recently. Break-ins, theft, property damage." Malcolm folded his hands. "Sorry to hear that." "Funny thing," Hutchins continued, "descriptions sometimes match travelers." "What description?" Malcolm asked. The sergeant smiled, not because something was funny, because he enjoyed the moment. "You know exactly what description." Terrence felt his pulse rise. The statement was vague enough to deny later and obvious enough to communicate its real meaning. A practiced technique. Malcolm recognized it instantly. Across the room, a little girl asked her mother a question. The mother whispered for her to stay quiet. That small moment hit Malcolm harder than the confrontation itself. Children learned fear by watching adults, and this town had been teaching that lesson for years. Hutchins straightened. "Both of you are coming outside." "Why?" Malcolm asked calmly. "Because I'm asking nicely." The emphasis carried a threat. The younger deputy looked increasingly uncomfortable. His eyes drifted toward the floor every few seconds. Malcolm studied him carefully. There was a difference between corruption and silence. One was active. The other was passive. Both caused damage, but only one sometimes carried regret. Malcolm reached into his pocket and placed a $20 bill beside his untouched breakfast. Terrence followed. Neither man argued, not yet. They stood and walked toward the exit. Every eye followed them. Nobody spoke. The bell above the door rang as they stepped into the Kentucky sunlight. Heat rolled across the parking lot. A sheriff's cruiser sat directly beside their rental sedan. Hutchins pointed toward the patrol vehicle, hands on the hood. Terrence stopped. "What's the probable cause?" "The probable cause is me standing here asking questions." Malcolm exchanged a brief glance with his partner, then both men placed their hands on the hot metal. The hood nearly burned their palms. Behind them, Hutchins called for additional units. His voice carried confidence, absolute confidence. The confidence of a man who believed nobody would ever challenge him. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, then another. 4 deputies now surrounded 2 unarmed men whose only documented activity had been ordering breakfast. Malcolm heard gravel crunch beneath boots as Hutchins approached the rental vehicle. The sergeant opened doors, checked compartments, examined luggage, ignored legal boundaries completely. Terrence stared toward the horizon. The sky remained clear, beautiful, peaceful, almost mocking, because beneath that bright Kentucky morning, something ugly was finally emerging into daylight. And as Hutchins continued his search, Malcolm realized the investigation had already surpassed expectations. The evidence they needed was practically collecting itself. What neither officer knew yet was that an even bigger mistake was only minutes away. The parking lot felt smaller with every passing minute. 4 deputies stood around Malcolm Owens and Terrence Blake, while Sergeant Dale Hutchins paced between the patrol cars. Heat shimmered above the asphalt. Across the street, church bells echoed faintly through downtown Ridgedale. To anyone driving by, the scene probably looked routine. That illusion was exactly what made it dangerous. Abuse of authority often hid behind familiar uniforms and ordinary procedures. Hutchins slammed the trunk of the rental sedan shut. "Nothing interesting," he muttered. His frustration showed. He had expected to find something. Or perhaps he simply wanted an excuse to claim he had. Either possibility concerned Malcolm. Facts mattered less to certain people than control, and control was exactly what Hutchins appeared unwilling to surrender. The younger deputy, Cody Lassiter, stood several feet away near his cruiser. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. He avoided eye contact with everyone. Malcolm noticed the discomfort. The deputy wasn't enjoying this, but he wasn't stopping it either. That distinction lingered in Malcolm's mind. "Run them again," Hutchins ordered suddenly. One deputy looked confused. "We already checked their records, Sergeant." "Then check deeper." The deputy hesitated, only briefly, then he obeyed. That single moment told Malcolm something important. The department operated on fear, not respect, fear. The difference was enormous. Hutchins walked back toward Malcolm. "You know what's funny?" "What's that?" Malcolm asked. "People come through here acting like laws don't apply to them." "Laws apply to everyone." The answer sounded simple, but it visibly irritated Hutchins. His jaw tightened. "Not everybody understands that." Terrence finally spoke. "Seems like some people understand it less than others." The comment landed, hard. Several deputies looked away. Hutchins stepped forward. Too close. The kind of proximity designed to intimidate. "You got something to say?" Terrence met his gaze. "Just making conversation." For a moment, nobody moved. The entire parking lot seemed frozen. Even the distant traffic sounded quieter. Then Hutchins laughed. A cold laugh, one without humor. "Funny guy." He turned away and radioed dispatch again. While he spoke, Malcolm studied the diner windows. Faces watched from inside. Brenda stood near the register. A farmer leaned against the glass. Several customers had stopped eating entirely. Everyone was witnessing the encounter, yet nobody intervened. Malcolm understood why. People living under intimidation often convinced themselves silence was survival. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes silence simply allowed the intimidation to grow stronger. Hutchins ended his radio call. Then he approached Malcolm once more. "Here's what's going to happen." The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something he had said many times before. "You're leaving this county today." Malcolm remained calm. "We haven't broken any laws." "Doesn't matter." There it was, the truth. Not hidden, not disguised, spoken openly. Terrence shook his head. "That's not how America works." "Maybe not where you're from," Hutchins replied. "But around here, people know how to behave." The statement carried layers of meaning, none of them legal. Malcolm felt a familiar sadness beneath his professional focus. His grandfather had heard similar words decades earlier in Alabama. Different voice, same message. You don't belong. Some ideas survived generations because too few people challenged them. A second patrol unit arrived, then a third. 6 officers now occupied the parking lot. The display wasn't about safety. It was about dominance. And everyone knew it. Hutchins removed a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted beneath the morning sun. "Last chance," he said. "For what?" Malcolm asked. "Leave town." Terrence looked toward Malcolm. Neither man moved, neither man answered. The silence seemed to enrage Hutchins more than any argument could have. His face reddened, a vein pulsed along his neck. "You think you're smart," he snapped. "No," Malcolm replied quietly. "I think the law matters." The word struck a nerve. Hutchins stepped forward and grabbed Malcolm's collar. The parking lot fell completely silent. Every deputy saw it. Every witness inside the diner saw it. Every camera hidden on Malcolm and Terrence recorded it. The moment stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then Hutchins released his grip. His breathing had become uneven. His judgment was disappearing, and Malcolm realized something crucial. The sergeant was no longer thinking about consequences. He was operating entirely on anger, which meant the biggest mistake of his career was about to happen. The handcuffs hung from Dale Hutchins's fingers as he stared at Malcolm Owens. The parking lot had become a stage. Deputies stood motionless. Customers watched through diner windows. Even the wind seemed to pause. Malcolm remained calm. That calmness confused Hutchins. Most people became nervous when surrounded by armed officers. Most people argued, protested, or tried to leave. Malcolm did none of those things. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. The behavior unsettled Hutchins more than resistance ever could. "Turn around," Hutchins ordered. His voice carried less confidence now. "Am I under arrest?" Malcolm asked. "You're about to be." "For what crime?" The question landed like a punch, because there wasn't a real answer. Everyone present knew it. The deputies knew it. The witnesses knew it. Most importantly, Hutchins knew it. But pride had already taken control. And pride rarely retreats once it reaches the edge. "Obstruction," Hutchins snapped. "How have we obstructed anything?" No response. Only anger. Terrence watched carefully. Years of investigative work had taught him that dangerous moments often arrived quietly. Not during shouting, during silence. Hutchins stepped closer. "You think you're special?" Malcolm shook his head. "No." "Then why won't you follow instructions?" "Because lawful instructions and unlawful instructions aren't the same thing." Several deputies exchanged nervous glances. The statement was simple, accurate, and impossible to argue against. For the first time, doubt began appearing on faces throughout the parking lot. Hutchins noticed it. That made everything worse. People who depend on unquestioned authority often react badly when others begin questioning it. The sergeant grabbed Malcolm's shoulder, hard. "I've had enough." Terrence took a small step forward. Immediately, two deputies shifted position. Tension surged. The atmosphere felt electric. One mistake could send everything spiraling. Yet Malcolm remained remarkably composed. Inside, his thoughts were racing. Every second of footage had been captured, every statement recorded, every violation documented. The investigation already possessed enough evidence to justify serious consequences. Still, he needed Hutchins to reveal exactly who he was. Not privately, publicly, in front of witnesses. The truth carried greater weight when communities saw it with their own eyes. "Last warning," Hutchins said. "For what?" "For refusing to cooperate." Malcolm looked around the parking lot, then toward the diner, then back at the sergeant. "I've cooperated with everything." Again, nobody could dispute the statement. The record spoke for itself. Identification provided, questions answered. Vehicle searched, property examined, compliance had been constant. Yet the confrontation continued, because the issue had never been cooperation. The issue was control, and control was slipping away. A drop of sweat rolled down Hutchins's forehead. His breathing grew heavier. The younger deputy, Cody Lassiter, shifted uneasily. Finally, he spoke. "Sergeant, maybe we should wrap this up." The words came cautiously, respectfully, almost apologetically, but they carried enormous significance. Someone had finally questioned the situation. Hutchins spun toward him. "Nobody asked your opinion." Lassiter immediately fell silent, yet the damage was done. A crack had appeared. The illusion of unanimous support was gone. Malcolm saw it. So did everyone else. Hutchins reached for Malcolm's arm again. This time his hand trembled slightly. Anger, frustration, fear, all beginning to merge. "You're coming with me," he said. "No," Malcolm replied. The single word echoed through the lot. Not loud, not aggressive. Just firm, absolute. The response stunned Hutchins. For a brief moment, he looked genuinely confused, as if nobody had ever calmly refused him before. Then came the explosion. "You don't get to tell me no." The outburst echoed across Main Street. People emerged from nearby businesses, heads turned, attention shifted toward the growing scene. Malcolm studied the sergeant carefully. The moment had arrived. The line had been crossed. Everything necessary had been documented. Everything necessary had been witnessed. The investigation was complete. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm reached inside his jacket. Instantly, several deputies tensed. Hutchins's hand dropped toward his holster. "Don't move." But Malcolm continued calmly. 2 fingers, 1 motion, no sudden movements. Then he removed a black leather credential wallet. The gold badge inside caught the sunlight. And in that exact moment, Dale Hutchins's entire world began collapsing. For several seconds, nobody moved. The gold badge reflected the morning sunlight like a signal flare. Malcolm Owens held it steady. The words engraved beneath the state seal were impossible to miss. Kentucky Bureau of Professional Standards, Senior Investigator. The parking lot became completely silent. A truck passing on Main Street slowed. Inside the diner, customers pressed closer to the windows. Even the deputies seemed frozen. Dale Hutchins stared at the badge, then at Malcolm, then back at the badge. The confidence that had fueled him all morning vanished instantly. His face lost color. The hand resting near his holster dropped to his side. The handcuffs slipped from his fingers. They hit the pavement with a metallic clang that sounded much louder than it should have. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The truth had arrived. And it was devastating. Terrence Blake calmly removed his own credentials. He held them beside Malcolm's. "Investigator Terrence Blake," he said. His voice remained professional, controlled, almost emotionless. That made the moment even more powerful. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was accountability. Pure and simple. Hutchins swallowed. "Wait a second." The words came out weak, barely audible. "No," Malcolm replied. "You've had plenty of seconds." The statement struck harder than any shouted accusation. For the first time all morning, Hutchins looked frightened, truly frightened. Malcolm took one step forward. The sergeant instinctively stepped backward. The reversal was impossible to ignore. Only minutes earlier, Hutchins had controlled every aspect of the encounter. Now he couldn't even hold eye contact. "Everything you've said today has been recorded," Malcolm said. "Everything?" "Everything." Terrence reached into his jacket and removed a concealed recording device. A small red light blinked steadily. Still recording, still documenting, still preserving every word. Several deputies stared at the device. One actually closed his eyes. The realization was sinking in. Nothing could be explained away. Nothing could be rewritten. The evidence existed. Complete, permanent. Hutchins looked toward his deputies, searching for support, searching for rescue. Finding neither. "Tell them," he said desperately. "Tell them I was following procedure." Nobody answered. Not a single deputy, not even Cody Lassiter. The silence felt enormous, because silence had protected Hutchins for years. Now that same silence was abandoning him. Malcolm removed his phone and dialed a number. The call connected almost immediately. "Captain Crawford," he said, "we have sufficient evidence. Request immediate administrative intervention and supervisory response." He listened, then nodded. "Understood. We'll hold the scene." The call ended. Hutchins' shoulders sagged. He knew exactly what that conversation meant. State officials were coming. The investigation was no longer theoretical, no longer confidential, no longer avoidable. Across the parking lot, Brenda Carlisle stepped outside. The diner owner looked overwhelmed. Her eyes glistened with tears. Not because she was surprised, because she wasn't. That was the tragedy. Nothing she had witnessed that morning shocked her. She had simply never expected anyone powerful enough to stop it. Malcolm noticed her expression. It reminded him why these investigations mattered. The victims rarely expected miracles. Most simply wanted somebody to care, somebody to listen, somebody willing to acknowledge reality. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, not emergency sirens. Official vehicles, state vehicles. The sound drifted closer with every passing second. Hutchins heard them too. His eyes followed the road leading into town. Fear now dominated his face completely. For years, he had controlled encounters like this. For years, complaints disappeared. For years, witnesses remained silent. For years, consequences never arrived. Today was different. Today, the consequences were driving directly toward him. And as three unmarked black sedans appeared at the far end of Main Street, Malcolm realized something important. The investigation wasn't ending. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because if one sergeant had operated this openly for years, someone else had been helping him stay protected. The three black sedans rolled into Ridgedale County like a storm nobody had prepared for. They carried no flashing lights, no dramatic sirens, no public spectacle. Just quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The vehicles stopped beside the sheriff's cruisers. Doors opened almost simultaneously. 4 investigators stepped out wearing plain clothes and visible credentials. Leading them was Agent Rebecca Marsh. She had spent 27 years investigating corruption throughout Kentucky. Her reputation was simple: If she arrived, somebody's career was ending. Marsh walked directly toward Malcolm. "Investigator Owens. Agent Marsh." They shook hands briefly. No smiles, no celebration. Professional people understood that accountability was never entertainment. It was responsibility. Marsh turned toward Dale Hutchins. The sergeant looked smaller now, not physically, emotionally. The certainty that once surrounded him had disappeared. "Sergeant Hutchins," Marsh said, "you are being relieved of duty pending investigation." Nobody moved. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. "I need your service weapon, badge, department keys, and identification." Hutchins stared at her. For a brief moment, Malcolm wondered whether he might refuse. Instead, the sergeant slowly reached for his equipment belt. His hands shook, the same hands that had confidently searched vehicles and threatened arrests less than an hour earlier. Now they struggled to unfasten a simple buckle. One piece at a time, authority left him. The firearm, the badge, the keys. Symbols of power surrendered in complete silence. Several diner customers watched from the sidewalk. More people gathered nearby. News traveled quickly in small towns, especially when powerful people suddenly became vulnerable. Marsh handed the equipment to another investigator. Then she looked directly at Hutchins. "You are instructed not to contact potential witnesses, department personnel, or members of this investigation. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Out loud, Sergeant." Hutchins swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." The answer sounded defeated, because it was. Across the parking lot, Cody Lassiter watched everything unfold. Malcolm studied the young deputy carefully. Regret was written across his face. Not fear. Regret. There was a difference. Fear focused on consequences. Regret focused on choices. And Lassiter suddenly appeared burdened by both. Marsh approached him next. "Deputy Lassiter, you'll be contacted for a formal interview." "I understand. You were present for the entire encounter?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you observed everything that occurred?" The deputy hesitated, only briefly, then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Malcolm noticed something important. For the first time all morning, Lassiter wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking directly at the investigators. Perhaps the silence protecting Ridgedale County was finally beginning to crack. Meanwhile, Brenda Carlyle stepped closer. Her hands trembled. But she approached anyway. That took courage. The kind of courage ordinary people rarely receive credit for. "Ma'am," Malcolm said gently, "I need to tell somebody the truth." The words came out immediately, as though they had been trapped inside her for years. "Then tell us." Tears formed in her eyes. He collected money from local businesses, called it protection. Everybody knew. Nobody talked about it. The statement changed everything. Malcolm exchanged a glance with Agent Marsh. This was no longer just a civil rights investigation. This was becoming something much larger. Corruption, extortion, systemic abuse. The pieces were starting to connect. And if Brenda was willing to speak, others might follow. Marsh immediately assigned an investigator to take her statement. Within minutes, 2 more business owners approached from nearby storefronts. Then another, then another. People who had remained silent for years suddenly wanted to talk. The sight fascinated Malcolm. Fear often seemed permanent, until someone finally challenged it. Then it weakened astonishingly fast. As Hutchins was escorted toward one of the sedans, he stopped and looked back at the diner, at the deputies, at the town, at the life he believed would never change. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It wasn't even defensive. It was confused, as though he genuinely couldn't understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. The sedan door closed, the vehicle pulled away. And for the first time in years, Ridgedale County stood without the man who had dominated it. Yet as Malcolm watched the car disappear down Main Street, a troubling thought settled into his mind. 8 complaints had been buried. Businesses had allegedly paid protection money. Multiple deputies had stayed silent. That kind of corruption didn't survive for years because of one man alone. Someone higher up had been looking the other way, and Malcolm intended to find out exactly who. 3 days after Dale Hutchins was removed from duty, Ridgedale County no longer felt like the same town. The change wasn't visible in buildings or streets. The courthouse still stood in the center of town. The church bells still rang every Sunday morning. Farmers still gathered at the diner before sunrise. But conversations had changed. People were talking. For years they had whispered. Now they were speaking out loud. And that frightened certain people far more than any investigation ever could. Malcolm Owens sat inside a temporary operations office established in a vacant county administration building. Stacks of witness statements covered his desk. Every hour brought new information. Every statement revealed another piece of a much larger puzzle. The corruption surrounding Hutchins wasn't isolated. It never had been. 23 witnesses so far, Terrence said. He placed another folder onto the growing pile, and they're still coming. Malcolm opened the file. Inside was testimony from a retired teacher, then a truck driver, then a former city employee. Different people, different backgrounds, different years. Yet their stories sounded remarkably similar. Threats, harassment, selective enforcement, pressure to remain silent. Patterns never lied. And the pattern emerging in Ridgedale County was impossible to ignore. Late that afternoon, Agent Rebecca Marsh entered the office carrying a sealed evidence box. Her expression told Malcolm the contents mattered. "We searched Hutchins's office this morning." She placed the box on the table. Inside were ledgers, handwritten notes, photocopies of financial records, receipts, cash transaction logs. Terrence leaned forward. "Please tell me he wasn't dumb enough to keep records." Marsh allowed herself a small smile. People who avoid consequences for years start believing they're smarter than everyone else. Malcolm examined one notebook. Names filled the pages. Businesses, dates, dollar amounts. The pattern was obvious. Monthly payments, regular collections, protection money. Brenda Carlisle's name appeared repeatedly. So did several other business owners. The room fell silent. This wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't rumor. It was evidence, documented, detailed, devastating. "How far up does it go?" Terrence asked. Marsh didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed Malcolm another file. The name on the cover made his stomach tighten. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw, Ridgedale County Sheriff, elected official, Hutchins's direct superior. Malcolm opened the folder. Internal complaint reports filled the pages. Every complaint against Hutchins had passed through the sheriff's office. Every complaint had been dismissed. Every investigation had been closed. Without meaningful review, without witness interviews, without supporting documentation. The pattern repeated 8 times. Exactly 8. No mistakes, no oversights, a deliberate decision, again and again. Outside, storm clouds gathered above Ridgedale County. Thunder rolled across the Kentucky hills. The first drops of rain struck the windows. The timing felt symbolic. Years of buried misconduct were finally surfacing, and the weather seemed determined to participate. That evening, Sheriff Bradshaw held a press conference. Television cameras crowded into the county meeting room. Reporters filled every seat. The sheriff stood behind a wooden podium wearing a dark suit. His expression appeared serious, concerned, professional. Malcolm watched the broadcast from the operations office. "The actions of Sergeant Hutchins do not reflect the values of this department," Bradshaw announced. Terrence laughed quietly, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Then a reporter stood. "Sheriff Bradshaw, why were 8 complaints dismissed under your administration?" The room immediately grew tense. Bradshaw adjusted his tie. "Those matters were reviewed appropriately." Another reporter followed. "Reviewed by whom?" A third joined in. "Why were witnesses never interviewed?" A fourth raised her hand. "Did you know local businesses were allegedly paying protection money?" The sheriff's confidence began fading, just slightly. But Malcolm noticed. The questions kept coming. Harder, sharper, more specific. For years, Bradshaw had operated in a controlled environment. Now the environment was controlling him. When the press conference finally ended, nobody in the room looked satisfied, least of all the sheriff. Malcolm turned off the television. Outside, rain hammered the windows. Inside, a troubling realization settled over everyone present. The investigation had officially moved beyond Dale Hutchins, and before the week ended, the evidence would place one of the most powerful men in the county directly under the spotlight. The federal investigation officially expanded 2 weeks later. What began with a breakfast stop at Brenda's Grill House had become one of the largest public corruption inquiries in Kentucky's recent history. By then, Ridgedale County existed under a microscope. State investigators occupied temporary offices. Federal attorneys reviewed evidence daily. News vans parked outside government buildings from sunrise until dark. For years, powerful people had relied on public attention fading quickly. This time, it wasn't fading. It was growing. Malcolm Owens arrived at the operations center before dawn. Rain from the previous night still covered the streets. Low clouds drifted across the hills surrounding town. The courthouse looked gray and tired beneath the morning sky. Inside the building, investigators moved quietly between offices carrying files and evidence boxes. Nobody spoke much. The work had become too important, too serious, too close to exposing something much larger than anyone originally expected. Terrence entered, carrying fresh reports. "You're going to want to see this." Malcolm looked up. That sentence rarely brought good news. Terrence dropped 3 folders onto the desk. The first contained financial records. The second contained internal county communications. The third contained sworn testimony from former employees. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. Protection payments hadn't simply disappeared into Dale Hutchins's pocket. Money had moved elsewhere: accounts, contracts, campaign contributions, expenses that made little sense. Small amounts individually, significant amounts collectively. Malcolm reviewed the documentation carefully. The numbers formed a pattern. Patterns always mattered. And this pattern pointed directly toward Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw. Terrence sat down. He knew. It wasn't a question. Malcolm nodded slowly. Maybe worse. The possibility lingered between them. Knowledge implied negligence. Participation implied conspiracy. Both carried consequences. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. The change transformed the town. Storefront windows brightened. Church steeples reflected gold. Wet pavement shimmered. Malcolm watched the scene through his office window. Ridgedale looked beautiful. That was another lesson life had taught him. Beautiful places were fully capable of hiding ugly truths. Around noon, Agent Rebecca Marsh entered, carrying a sealed federal subpoena. Her expression was unreadable. "We received authorization this morning." Malcolm understood immediately. The case had crossed another threshold. Federal prosecutors were now involved. Officially, publicly, irreversibly. Marsh placed the paperwork on the table. "Sheriff Bradshaw will be interviewed tomorrow." Terrence leaned back. "Voluntarily?" Marsh smiled faintly. "Let's call it strongly encouraged." That evening, local television stations interrupted regular programming. Breaking news banners appeared across Kentucky. Reporters stood outside county offices delivering live updates. Citizens gathered in restaurants, living rooms, and community centers watching developments unfold. Brenda Carlisle watched from the diner. Customers filled nearly every booth. Not because of the food, because everyone wanted answers. For years, people had accepted certain realities as permanent. Certain officials, certain systems, certain abuses. Now those assumptions were collapsing, and nobody knew what would replace them. Later that night, Malcolm drove alone through Ridgedale County. He passed farms, schools, neighborhoods, baseball fields. Ordinary places where ordinary people lived their lives. The investigation wasn't really about politicians or deputies. It was about them, the families who deserved honest institutions, the children who deserved better examples, the communities that deserved trust. Those thoughts stayed with him as he returned to headquarters. Near midnight, his phone rang. Only a handful of people possessed the number. Malcolm answered immediately. Captain Elaine Crawford's voice came through the line. "I just got off a conference call with federal prosecutors." The tone in her voice made Malcolm sit upright. "What happened?" A brief pause followed. Then she delivered the news. "Tomorrow's interview isn't happening anymore." Malcolm frowned. "Why not?" Another pause, longer this time, because Sheriff Bradshaw hired an attorney this afternoon. Silence filled the room, then Crawford added one final sentence. "And according to the attorney, the sheriff is no longer willing to answer questions without immunity." Malcolm stared into the darkness outside his window. That single request revealed more than any interview ever could, because innocent people usually asked for representation. People worried about criminal exposure asked for immunity. And suddenly, the investigation had reached an entirely different level. The request for immunity changed everything. By sunrise the next morning, every investigator working the Ridgedale case understood the significance. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw had not denied the allegations. He had not volunteered cooperation. He had not demanded an opportunity to clear his name. Instead, he wanted protection. Legal protection. That decision echoed through the investigation like thunder before a storm. Malcolm Owens arrived at headquarters before dawn. The building was already busy. Phones rang constantly. Federal attorneys moved between conference rooms. Investigators carried evidence files from office to office. Nobody needed motivation. The case was gathering momentum on its own. Terrence Blake stood beside a whiteboard covered with timelines and names. Over the previous month, the board had grown crowded. Business owners, former deputies, county employees, witnesses, financial transactions, complaint reports. Every thread connected to the same central question: how many people knew? That question mattered more than anything else. Corruption rarely survived alone. It required cooperation, participation, or silence, sometimes all three. Agent Rebecca Marsh entered carrying a sealed envelope. Federal prosecutors approved additional warrants. Malcolm accepted the paperwork. The list was extensive: financial records, county communications, property transactions, campaign accounts. Years of information, years of decisions, years of potential misconduct. The investigation had moved beyond individual behavior. Now it was examining the entire structure surrounding it. Outside, television crews gathered once again near county offices. News coverage had become relentless. Every development generated headlines. Every document created new questions. And public attention showed no signs of fading. Across Kentucky, people followed the story closely, not because Ridgedale County was unique, because many communities recognized parts of themselves within it. People understood what happened when authorities stopped answering to accountability. That lesson felt universal. Around noon, investigators executed the new warrants. Records arrived by the box: computers, documents, archived correspondence. Years of institutional memory suddenly available for examination. By late afternoon, Malcolm sat reviewing hundreds of emails. Most contained routine government business, budget discussions, scheduling matters, administrative updates. Then he found one message, and then another, and another. His expression hardened. Terrence noticed immediately. "What did you find?" Malcolm rotated the screen. The emails revealed conversations regarding citizen complaints, not investigations, not fact-finding, strategies, methods for minimizing public attention, approaches for avoiding scrutiny, language designed to protect reputations rather than discover truth. Terrence read quietly, then exhaled. They weren't reviewing complaints. "No," Malcolm replied, "they were managing them." The distinction was enormous. One represented oversight, the other represented concealment. Evening approached. Sunlight streamed through office windows. Long shadows stretched across stacks of evidence. The atmosphere felt different now, less uncertain, more focused. Investigators no longer wondered whether misconduct existed. The evidence answered that question repeatedly. The only remaining issue involved accountability. Who would ultimately face it? Shortly after 6 o'clock, Captain Elaine Crawford arrived in person. That alone signaled importance. She rarely left Frankfurt during active investigations. Everyone gathered inside the main conference room. Federal attorneys joined by video conference. State officials filled the remaining seats. The room became completely quiet. Crawford stood at the front. She reviewed her notes, then looked directly at the group. "The evidence has been evaluated." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Federal prosecutors have reached a decision. A heavy silence settled over the room. Every investigator understood what was coming, but hearing it mattered. Crawford continued. "Tomorrow morning, formal criminal charges will be announced against Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw." No one appeared surprised. The evidence demanded it, yet the moment still carried weight. A county sheriff, an elected official, one of the most powerful figures in the region, now facing public prosecution. The room remained silent. Then Crawford added another sentence. one nobody expected. And Bradshaw isn't the only official named in the charging documents. Malcolm looked up immediately. Several investigators exchanged startled glances. Additional names, additional defendants, additional revelations. The investigation was about to become far bigger than anyone outside the room realized. And by the following morning, all of Kentucky would learn exactly how deep the corruption had gone. The announcement shook Kentucky before most people finished breakfast. Every major news station interrupted scheduled programming. Radio hosts abandoned their planned topics. Social media feeds filled with headlines. Federal prosecutors had officially charged Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw. But the sheriff was only part of the story. 3 additional county officials faced charges related to obstruction, misconduct, and conspiracy. Years of hidden decisions had finally surfaced. Years of silence had become evidence. And years of power had suddenly become liability. Malcolm Owens watched the press conference from a federal conference room in Frankfort. Investigators filled the seats around him. Nobody celebrated. Professional investigators understood something important. Justice wasn't a victory lap, it was a correction. A necessary correction. Federal prosecutors outlined the findings carefully. Complaint reports had been suppressed. Witnesses had been ignored. Evidence had been dismissed. Internal reviews had been manipulated. Public trust had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. The facts spoke for themselves. No dramatic language was necessary. Truth carried enough weight. Across the state, people watched in disbelief. Some felt vindicated. Some felt embarrassed. Others felt angry. But nobody could pretend the evidence didn't exist. That option had disappeared. Months later, the trials began. Courtrooms remained crowded. Journalists filled every available seat. Witness after witness testified. Business owners, former deputies, county employees, citizens whose complaints had been ignored. Their stories formed a consistent pattern. Different experiences, same system. The defense attorneys worked hard. They challenged timelines. They questioned memories. They criticized procedures. Yet the documents remained. The recordings remained. The financial records remained. Facts proved remarkably difficult to argue with. Brenda Carlisle eventually took the witness stand. The diner owner looked nervous, but she spoke clearly. For years, she had paid money she didn't owe because she feared consequences. For years, she believed nobody would help. For years, she convinced herself survival required silence. Then she looked toward the jury. The worst thing wasn't the fear, she said. The worst thing was believing fear was normal. The courtroom fell silent. Several jurors wrote notes. Others simply listened, because everyone understood the truth inside those words. Fear becomes dangerous when communities start treating it like ordinary life. Months later, verdicts arrived. Convictions, resignations, permanent disqualifications from public office. Financial penalties, prison sentences. The outcomes varied, the accountability did not. Ridgedale County entered a period of reform. Independent oversight boards were established. Complaint procedures changed. External reviews became mandatory. New training programs focused on ethics, transparency, and constitutional rights. The process wasn't perfect. No reform ever is. But it was real, and real progress mattered. 1 year after that morning at Brenda's Grill House, Malcolm and Terrence returned quietly. No media, no speeches, no ceremony, just breakfast. The diner looked different, brighter somehow. The atmosphere felt lighter. Customers laughed openly. Conversations flowed naturally. People seemed comfortable in a way they hadn't before. Brenda greeted them with a smile that finally reached her eyes. "Corner booth?" she asked. Malcolm smiled. "Feels appropriate." They sat in the same place where everything had started. Near the booth hung a small wooden sign. The words were simple. "Everyone belongs here." Nothing elaborate, nothing political, just a reminder. Outside, sunlight covered Main Street. Children rode bicycles past storefronts. Families entered shops. Church bells echoed in the distance. Life continued. As it always does. Terrence looked around the diner. Think it was worth it? Malcolm considered the question. He thought about the witnesses, the investigations, the courtrooms, the consequences, the cost. Then he looked toward the sign hanging above the booth. Yes, he said, because accountability isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the next generation inherits something better. Outside, the town continued moving forward. Not perfect, not healed completely, but moving. And sometimes, movement in the right direction is where justice truly begins. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.